Hey everyone, it's Rollie, and I'm just going to see if it looks like I'm live, but I don't know if I can see comments. Oh, there we go. So there's another screen. So that's perfect. Okay. So for those of you who are just hopping on, if you can just put a comment in to let me know that you're here. And thanks, Krista. So welcome. So I am so excited to be able to do this in this group, Awaken Your the Goddess Within. And I want to thank Flora for being able to do this and for allowing me to be able to do this. And we're going to have my my puppy who's going to decide to get comfortable. So here is, so today what it is that we're talking about is being able to parent with experiencing trauma, so after experiencing trauma. So as I've said, so I know that Krista's here, I'm not sure who else is here, but whoever else it is that pops on, if you can just hit comment to let me know. Oh, it's Flora, welcome. So I was just saying that my dog was going to come in and get comfortable, and now my kitten is coming in to cause some havoc. so hopefully she'll be able to stay fairly quiet. But okay, so welcome. So as I said, we're actually going to be talking about parenting with trauma. So this is a subject that is dear to my heart. It is something that I have both worked with clients and as well as had my own personal experience as being a mom of a now 23-year-old and 21-year-old. And so these are, so my boys are no longer little boys anymore, although they are still my babies and will always forever be my babies, whether they like that or not. But so I created them. I'm allowed to say that they were forever going to be mine. So, so one of the things that is that I just wanted to be able to start with is being able to kind of tap into, has this ever happened to you where you thought, geez, everything is just getting right back on track, everything is going great, and then just out of nowhere, things just kind of creep back up again, and we struggle with memories or emotions or things of the past that just kind of creep back up again, and we think, wow, where did this come from? I thought I put this to bed already, and here it is right back up again, and I'm not sure where it's coming from, what's happening. And it makes it very frustrating because especially if you've actually worked on this for a long period of time and you thought, okay, it's all settled, it's all done, now I get to move on and have a family and I'm working and all these things are starting to come up, and you get bogged down by all of these emotions, and so it gets very, very frustrating. And so and I tend to speak fast, so I'm going to try really hard to not go so fast. But it's with years of therapy, we sometimes have like all these things that have actually been put in place, and then we bring our kids into the world, and everything starts all over again. And it's like, where did this come from, and why are we doing this again? And so our emotions start to flare up, and our inadequacies. That's one of the biggest challenges, is all those feelings that we were feeling inadequate about creep back up again. And so that becomes a huge challenge, because those feelings of inadequacy make us really struggle with where it is that we're going. Hi, Robin. Thanks for joining me. And so so in our mind, we actually wonder what it is that's going on. So we've got these emotions that are flaring back up again, and it's a vicious cycle starts all over again. And so we really struggle with being able to kind of tap back into where it is that we're going with. And so where do we want to go from here, and how do we want to be able to deal with this? Because as a mom, we just want to be the best mom that we can be. So no matter what it is that's happened to us in our past, when we become a mom, we just want the best for our kids. We don't want them to live through the same experiences we have. We want them to, whether it was childhood traumas that we've experienced, or it is adult traumas that we've experienced. We don't want that for our kids. So let's first start with being able to introduce myself. So my name is Rollie Allaire, and I am a holistic wellness coach, a spirit flame keeper, and a soul healer. And so my spirit name is Gigado Miigwin Kwe, and it stands for Talking Feather Woman. And so when I first got my name, I was like, I'm not really sure where this name is coming from, or like, so I thought maybe it was just because I talked a lot, and that was where the elder had actually come up with my name. And so that was probably about 7 years ago now that I was given my spirit name. And great, I'm glad to see that Griffin is actually hitting some of the reactions. That's wonderful. Hi, Michelle, nice to meet you. I'm glad to see that you joined us. And so so what it is that I do is I actually work with women who have experienced childhood trauma or sexual trauma, domestic violence, or grief. And my goal is to be able to help women retrieve that lost part of their soul and to achieve wellness, success, and joy in their lives. And so that is my goal. So for more than 17 years, I've actually worked in a clinical setting. And so within that clinical setting, I've oftentimes used some not so traditional approaches when I've dealt with my clients. So we're supposed to be, when we're in clinical psychology, we're supposed to be doing these certain things, we're supposed to follow these certain patterns, but sometimes those patterns just don't fit for everybody. And so my approach has always been a little different than just the run-of-the-mill kind of approaches. I didn't know back then that I was an empath, and that I actually picked up on other people's emotions. And so some of the things that I thought were just normal reactions or responses to some of the things that were going on, other people were not able to pick up on those same cues. And that was because I could actually sense them differently than my colleagues. And so it wasn't until I was actually doing some teaching that I was actually had some students with me, and we were talking about body language, and we had reviewed a session. So the student had come in with me on the session. We did everything that I did, all my session with the client, and when we were done, we debriefed and we were talking about some of the things, and the student said to me, so I said, okay, well, tell me some of the things that you picked up on. And there were some things that she didn't pick up on. And so I said, well, what about these things? And she's like, oh, well, how did that happen? And so, and I said, well, if you actually watch their body language. And she's like, but there was no body language changes. And so that was one of my first indicators that it was like, oh, there's something like a little bit different here. But again, I still didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it. I just thought, okay, well, we obviously have different perceptions, and just kind of moved on and did whatever. And so there was a couple of other times that those kinds of things happened that I kind of went, oh, okay. And then I actually met with someone who said, you are an empath and you're a healer. And I'm like, okay, whatever. Like, you're a little bit crazy, but I'll continue with my reading because like that's what I'm here for, but whatever. And so I just kind of let it go with that. And then I moved on with continuing on. And then a couple of other times somebody had come up, and so I'm not sure if it was in this group, and I think it was actually probably in this group, or if not, it was on Flora's personal page, where she actually talked about threes, right? So things coming in threes and that kind of thing. And so that really resonated with me, because it was like it took 3 times for somebody to tell me that I actually had some healing abilities. And it was like, oh, okay. So the first time was like, whatever. Second time was like, well, yeah, somebody else has already told me that. And when the third person told me, it was like smacked me in the forehead and said, okay, I guess I should probably be exploring this a little bit further. And so sure enough, that is some of the things that are going on. So that's kind of things where I'm at. So when I started my practice 3 years ago, I decided that I didn't want to be confined to an agency where we were mandated to be able to do certain things or not do certain things, because my approaches were not necessarily in that little bubble. And so I decided that it was time for me to be able to start my own practice, which is something that I wanted to do from the time that I had started and said, like, my ultimate goal is to be able to start my own practice. So herein lies Bridging the Gap Wellness. And so over the last 3 years, it's evolved and it's changed, and it's still changing, and I'm still working on creating some new programs. And one of the things that I love about being able to do this is that I can actually incorporate some of the healing modalities that I wouldn't necessarily be able to use in a clinical setting. And so I use my clinical background of 17 years. And so then, and with that, I use my empathic abilities, and I use crystal Reiki, and I use essential oils, and I use the teachings of the Grandmother Moon, and one of the things that I really like that I use, and I'm glad that I'm actually able to incorporate that in this new program that I have, is using the medicine wheel. And so that's my background. That's who it is that's coming to you today and sharing with you. So one of the things that I am very much known for is being able to have a very safe and supportive environment. So that is something in terms of feedback from my clients that I get. And you're right, it's not a cookie cutter approach. And then unfortunately, in a clinical setting, we're supposed to be using everything as a cookie cutter approach, and people's experiences are not cookie cutters. So one of the first things that I want to be able to talk about is what's trauma. So when we actually talk about what is trauma, it is different for everybody. And so trauma is not the same for one person, and one person's experience with trauma is not going to be the same for the other person. And so you can actually have, so I grew up in a home with 4 kids, and so the 4 of us all experienced things differently and all had different approaches and different ways of coping with things than everybody else. So we all had our own roles, as we all do in families. And so it's all different. And so when one person has an experience, so like, for example, somebody who's been in a car accident, and you have 3 people in the same car accident, they all experience the exact same thing, but not each and every one of them are going to have a negative reaction or a negative impact in their life because of that accident, whether they've been physically injured or not. And so each person is going to have their own experience to that particular event. So even things like earthquakes. So somebody who's had experienced an earthquake and huge things have happened, or when we've talked to people with that have experienced tsunamis. Like, so all these people have experienced the exact same thing. However, they're not living the same experience, even though the situation was the same. And so a traumatic experience is something that actually threatens, that creates a threat to our life or our safety. And so, and like I said, it all is different for each person, and not one person is going to have that same experience. And one of the things that is really, so my friend Thuja is, who's also part of this group, I believe, and she actually had shared an experience or a blog about how being able to compare each person's trauma. So one person's trauma is not more important or difficult or challenging than another person. And so I really liked her blog. And so what I'm going to do when we're done is that I'm actually going to add Thuja's blog link into the comments, because I think that it's actually super, super important for us to be able to identify that. And so rather than reiterating it in my own words, I really like the way that Thuja explains it. And so I'm going to share Thuja's blog and be able to share with that. So traumatic events include things that happen to people unexpectedly. So trauma is something that it either happens to somebody unexpectedly, something that you were unprepared for, or that made you feel powerless, and or it could be something that has happened repeatedly, when somebody has been intentionally cruel, and sometimes it's happened in childhood. So these are some of the ways that trauma can actually occur. So childhood traumas include having unstable or unsafe environments, separation from a parent, serious illness of themselves or someone or a loved one, specifically a caretaker, but doesn't have to be a caretaker, but those are that's one of the times, and has been sexually, physically, or verbally been abused, witnessed domestic violence, and or suffered neglect. So like those are some of the things that so those are some of the examples of childhood trauma. So whether trauma has happened years ago or yesterday, healing that trauma can sometimes be challenging. And so that is one of the things that is really, really important for us to be able to keep that in mind. And so, and there's no, and as Michelle said, it's not a cookie cutter approach. So how one person handles dealing with the trauma is not necessarily going to be the same way that the other person is dealing with the trauma. And so, or dealing with that same similar trauma, because I won't say that it's the same trauma, because it's not the same trauma. And so when we experience childhood trauma, sometimes that can actually have long-lasting effects. And so that impacts our lives on an ongoing basis. And so those are some of the things that are really, really important for us to be able to keep in mind. And again, we all have different reactions, right? So it all depends on the circumstances. It depends on where we're at that particular point in our lives. And something that can be extremely traumatic, that may have been extremely traumatic to you back then, may not necessarily be something that you would actually have that same reaction to now, depending on what it is that's going on. So it kind of depends on what it is that's happening and how we are feeling and how we're reacting to it. So there's no right and wrong, and that is something that is extremely, extremely important, is that there's never a right and wrong as to how we react to trauma. And so sometimes trauma is a normal response to an abnormal situation. And so that is exactly what trauma, that's the best description that I can actually give for trauma. So so over the years, I've worked with a lot of clients, and so with those clients, they finally thought that things have actually been resolved and everything's good, and then just all of a sudden out of nowhere, it's like, holy wow, where did that come from? And so that makes things really, really difficult for us to be able to kind of deal with things. And so things that start creeping up sometimes can be like huge, right? So all of a sudden it's like this huge, my whole life is just overwhelming and I can't function, or different things just start creeping up. So we start having difficulty with functioning at work or at home. We start suffering from severe fear, anxiety, or depression. And so those are some of the those are some symptoms. And then unable to form close relationships. And so, or we pull away from close relationships. So triggers are challenged sometimes. You're absolutely right, Janice. And so triggers are huge. And being able to have difficulty with having satisfying relationships, experiencing horrific memories and or nightmares or flashbacks. And so those are always very difficult. Sometimes people will have those flashbacks that are only happening at nighttime, Other people will actually have flashbacks during the day. So different things will actually trigger them to be able to have those flashbacks. And sometimes there's just different little things that start to remind you of different parts of the trauma. So you'll be going about your day and something will just kind of flash past, and without it not necessarily being a flashback, but different things. So like I've had different people that have said just a name appeared, right? So they were driving along and on the side of a vehicle, a name appeared, and that is what triggered them. And so those are the different kinds of things. Sometimes we'll start to pull away. We start to distance ourselves from family or friends, and we start to isolate ourselves. And that is oftentimes one of the other symptoms that we actually have going on. Sometimes we actually start to experience using drugs or alcohol to help us feel better, numb the pain, to just kind of make things go away, right? So one of the things that I wanted to be able to touch into, though, is how to be able to tap into some of those resources that we've actually had from the past, right? Because we've already dealt with this. We've already dealt with these emotions and these things that have actually come up. So we have some really good resources. So one of our first skills is knowing when you've been triggered. You may not necessarily remember or know or have been able to figure out, pinpoint what it is that has actually triggered you initially when you first find out, but knowing that you've been triggered. So that's skill number one, right? So we have learned how to be able to identify that we've been triggered. Something has brought forward these emotions, that fear, that panic, that anxiety, those things that are actually, that we had already dealt with, they're coming back up. So we may not necessarily know what it is, but we know that we've been triggered. One of the other things that we're really good at is a skill number two is being able to normalize some of our symptoms, right? So we've learned to keep a lot of those symptoms to ourselves, and we've just learned to be able to like try and coast by without letting other people know what it is that's going on. So we can sometimes use excuses that, well, I didn't sleep well, the baby was up, or my toddler was up, or however old that these kids are, like these, so you're using those as excuses, but we've learned to be able to normalize it, right? So it's like, oh, well, it's not a big deal. These kinds of things happen, and they do, but when we're experiencing past trauma and these things are coming back up, that's something that's super, super important for us to be able to identify. Another skill that we're really good at is being able to mask our symptoms. So we get to normalize our symptoms, but then we also get to mask our symptoms, right? So we get to hide them and not let people know that these are the things that are going on. So we go to work and we're cheery and we're happy, and but then we're also snappy. We're also more short-tempered. We are also worried, so especially when anxiety is kicking in. So like there's a lot of worry, there's a lot of things that are going on. And so one of the things that, so those are some of the skills. So those are some of the skills that we've actually had that we can actually mask some of the things that are going on. But these are great skills. These are great ways of being able to know and identify that some of these things are going on. And because we've already been through it and we've already resolved the trauma in the first place, we can actually go back to using some of those skills, some of those things that we've actually, those strategies that we've actually used to be able to cope with them and to deal with them. And so, but it's important for us to be able to identify some of the things that are going on. So sometimes one of the things that we do is that we overcompensate, right? So we become overprotective, we become judgmental, or we become critical, and we just decide that we're just going to do things ourselves instead of asking for help, because we don't want anyone to know that these things are resurfacing again, because we don't know what it is that's happening or what's going on. And so those are things that are like super, super important for us to be able to do. And then and then, so we start doing all these things ourselves, and then we start feeling resentful because our partner's not helping us. Like, seriously, can our partner, and I don't want to say he or she because it kind of depends on who your partner is, but then it's like, seriously, like, why is that happening? So over the years, we've dealt with these things, and we know that these are some of the things that are happening, and we just need to reframe and put things back into place so that we can actually figure out what it is that's happening. So, so one of the things that, so I'm going to share a couple of experiences. One of the experiences is my personal experience. So I have, as a child, grown up in an environment where I wasn't feeling safe. And so, so over the years, it was kind of like, oh, well, Rollie just has anxiety and that kind of thing. But one of the things that I had, so when you kind of go back on retrospect, it's like, okay, well, there's a lot more to that than Rollie just having anxiety. There was a lot of things that were actually pretty traumatic growing up in my environment. And so, so as a child, I wasn't feeling safe. And so, but I had resolved those issues, and I had dealt with the things that I had actually needed to deal with. And it was like, it wasn't a big deal because I had learned to cope with those things. And it wasn't until I was older that I actually realized that a lot of those things stemmed from that unsafe environment growing up. And so, and then I had my kids. And then my son, my first son. And so he was beautiful. He was lovely. He was charming. He was like the best baby that you could ever have. And with the exception of him having colic episodes during the day, but it was during the day. So it wasn't unmanageable. We would just deal with them during those couple of hours, and we would take turns. His dad and I would take turns being able to manage those behavior, like those symptoms, and help him feel better. And so, but he was great. He nursed every 6 hours, or he nursed every 4 hours and 6 hours through the night, right before we even left the hospital. So like, you couldn't ask for a better baby, other than, like I said, those brief periods of colic when for about 6 weeks, and then after that things were great, and he was like the easiest baby to manage. And so and then all of a sudden, we get a notice from our landlord that says, okay, you guys need to move. And it's like, oh my God, seriously? Like, I'm getting ready to go back to work, and I've just had an emergency C-section, and now I have to try and move. And it's like, okay, I can cope with that, and I can deal with that. And things just kind of moved on, and that wasn't too big of a deal. But then I get a message, or then as I'm holding my son, I'm watching, the TV happens to come on. Like, I was watching TV and holding my son, and a news report came on, and it was April 19th, April 19th of 1995. And it was the Oklahoma bombing. And here I am preparing to go back to work. We now have to move, and I now have to find somebody to care for my kid, and this daycare has just been bombed. What am I going to do now? So all of those feelings that I had actually experienced growing up of not feeling safe, and now how am I going to keep my son safe? How am I going to be able to go back to work and keep my son safe? And so all of those feelings came back up again. And so I needed to cope with that, and I needed to deal with that, and I needed to come up with a plan. And so, like, that was very challenging, and that was, again, another very traumatic event for me. Yet my girlfriends were having their kids, and they were going back to work, and they were experiencing the same newscasts as I was. And they were like, it's in Oklahoma, it's not even here. Like, so, like, why are you, because we're in Northern Ontario, Canada. Like, so, like, this has nothing to do with us. But it was just all those things that were actually super challenging. And so go back to work. And so again, I learned how to be able to cope, because that's what it is that we do, right? So as moms, that's what we do. We learn how to cope, and we learn how to be able to deal with things, and we just kind of set things aside. But then I became very, very overprotective. So checking on him as often as I possibly could throughout the day, and making sure that all these things happen. And those plans didn't change. Like, so those patterns of me being overprotective didn't change. And I know that those patterns of overprotectiveness came from that particular event. My son potentially could not be safe, and I had no way of being able to protect him. And so I needed to come up with strategies to be able to do that, and being overprotective was one of my strategies. So time goes on, everything happens, things go, and then we continue on with my second son coming into life. So everything's great, everything's fantastic. I go back to work, and so we have somebody looking after both boys. And my son has had a lot of childhood medical issues. So he has asthma, and he's had sleep issues. And this wonderful, wonderful child of mine nursed every hour and a half. So we only did that for 6 weeks, and then we put him on formula. Because I also had a toddler that I needed to try and manage with. So, but Casey was 24/7, hour and a half, and then we put him on formula, and it was still every 3 hours, but at least somebody else could help me feed him. So that was helpful. But, so there was a lot of things. He would get urinary tract infections. Again, not a big deal. This is just Casey, who Casey is, and these are just some of the things that we needed to manage of being a mom. And when we were moms, we manage. We do all these things and go to work and take him to the emergency when we needed to, and all of these things, or talk to the doctor's office. So then we end up with a child who now has urinary tract infections, and all good. Friday, we're taking him to, of course, he gets the urinary tract infection on a Friday. Can't call the doctor's office, who will easily slide us in, but we can't do that now because it's the end of the day on Friday. So go up to the emerge. So here I am, fairly new mom of a second baby, and who has some health issues. And so head up to the emerge, and the doctor at the emerge says, "Oh, well, how do you know that he has a urinary tract infection?" And it was like, well, because I know that these are some of the things that, these are some of his symptoms. These are some of the things that we've already experienced. He's already been on antibiotics now 2 or 3 times by that point. And so he's like, "Oh, well, I think I need to report you to Child and Family Services, because a child this age shouldn't be getting urinary tract infections. That's usually a sign of sexual abuse." My heart sank. It was like, oh my God, seriously? These are some of the things that are going on? Flashbacks of my being sexually assaulted and flashbacks of being raped all come back flooding through. I've dealt with these. I don't need to deal with these again because I've already dealt with these. But as mom, all of those things come flooding back. And so then it's like, who's doing this? Is this his dad? Because they didn't get left alone with anybody other than a couple of people. So like, was it their dad? Was it their aunt? Like, who are these? Like, who's harming their child? Because I know that I'm not. And like these are some of the things that are going on. So this is a Friday. And so now I have to go through the entire weekend of trying to figure out how to be able to manage with these things, with these flashbacks now, and with the pangs of anxiety. And like, there's no way in hell that I'm going back to work on Monday, because I'm not leaving my son with anybody, because I don't know what it is that's going on. So now I'm calling in sick, and I'm taking 2 or 3 days off until I can finally get into the doctor's office. And of course, their dad thinks I'm absolutely crazy because he's only got a urinary tract infection. Like, seriously, he can stay with the babysitter who happened to be his sister. And it was like, yeah, no, I'm not leaving him with anybody until I can get in to see the doctor. And so we took him back in. And so, of course, there was no issues and there was nothing going on. It was simply that because he actually ate so often and he was having bowel movements so frequently that was what was causing the urinary tract infections. But he checked both, like my doctor was awesome, and he checked both kids, and that was great. So that was a huge relief. But at the same time, like, all these things come flooding back. So even though we deal with things, things happen. So, you're right, Shauna, it is our fear, our huge fear of not being able to keep our kids safe, especially when we've had our own experiences of trauma. And so those are some of my own personal experiences of having to deal with that recurring trauma that keeps coming back up again, right? So we put it to bed, we deal with it, it comes up, and then different things come up to trigger us. And especially when we're moms. And like I said, I'm so thankful that my kids are now 21 and 25, because I don't have those same triggers as I did when my kids were little. And as I was trying to manage working full-time and being a parent full-time and making sure that they stayed alive and kept them safe, right? So 2 active little boys. So that was just a whole other that was just a whole other ball of wax, right? So, and those are normal events, but it's just being able to try and figure out how to be able to do that. So, so those are some of the experiences that I've had. And then I've had, but then I've also had clients, right? So like over the years, back then when my kids were little, I wasn't actually practicing back then. I was actually in finance back then. And so then when I went back to school as an adult and as a single mom and actually went into psychotherapy, that is one of the things that I was actually, that was what I was actually drawn to, and being able to help people. And so, but when my kids were like that little, then I was, like I said, I was in finance. So that was me back then. But then I had a client. So I've had, like, again, several clients, but this particular client had an abortion. And so it was a chosen abortion. There wasn't any trauma around that particular abortion. And so, but just having an abortion is traumatic. So whether you've made a conscious choice or not. And so she was actually struggling with, so again, at the time they had made their sound decisions, her and her husband, they had moved on and whatever. And so she had been having a lot of difficulties. And so by the time she had come to see me, she had already seen 3 or 4 other people, and like there was nothing wrong with her and just move on. And again, because of the fact that I'm actually an empath, I was able to pick up on something that was much different than some of the other people had actually done, like that had actually picked up on. And so one of the things that I had actually been able to pick up on is that there was no closure with the death, right? So even though it was a chosen abortion, there was no closure on that particular death of losing her child. And so she was struggling with, they were actually preparing for being able to have another child, and like all these things just kept coming back. She kept having flashbacks of the abortion itself. She was having flashbacks of pangs of anxiety, and like she was having difficulty at work. And so these are some of the things that were actually going on. And so one of the things, the strategies that we ended up using was that we actually worked on, we actually treated it as grief, right? So we actually worked through the grief model of being able to handle this situation. And so the assignment that I had given her is that I sent her away to talk to, she had a very good, strong connection with her husband and with her older kids, like her, and so they had actually talked about the fact that they didn't have this baby anymore. And that was, again, years ago, but what they did was they actually named the baby. So they actually left, homework assignment was name the baby. And then they came back with, and then one of them, and I don't know who it was, I can't recall who it was that had done it, but somebody had actually drawn what the baby would actually look like. And so with that, they did the, so they named the baby, somebody drew a picture of the baby, and then one of the next things that she needed to do is she needed to write a letter to that baby. So she needed to write a letter to her child after they had named it, and to be able to put some closure and talk about like what were some of the things that were going on in their lives at that point and why it was not feasible for them to have, to be able to carry this baby to term, and why they had actually made the decisions that they did. And so the guilt that came back with the abortion of like, well, now we're looking to have another child, but we didn't keep this child. So like those feelings of those guilts. And so like, those are some of the things that we did. And then we actually did a burning ritual together. So we actually went outside, and at work, she brought the letter in, she read the letter, we shared through the things that we needed to do, and then we actually went out and we actually did a burning ceremony to be able to release that and to be able to let it go. And so that was the last time that I had seen her after that, because things were actually good, and it was very rewarding for her. And then after that happened, so then again, years ago, because once clients are done resolving that particular issue, I don't typically see them again, right? So unless they cross my path again for whatever reason, then I don't really know how things went, how things didn't go, if things crept back up, or if things weren't resolved. I don't necessarily know that once we're done working together. And so ironically, I ended up running into her years later, and so that was one of the things that she had said. They had their new baby, and everything was great that way. And one of the things that she had said is that was the most releasing thing that she's ever been able to do, and she no longer gets those pangs of guilt anymore. And they still have, because they actually had a funeral. Like her and her husband and her other children, they had a little funeral for this baby, and they were able to release it. And now that I actually work with, on that spiritual realm, is she and the spirit needed to be able to connect, but then they also needed to be able to release so that spirit can actually move on, and so that she could actually do what it is that she needed to be doing to be able to move on in this life. And so, like, it was very, very rewarding. But we all have different events, right? So somebody will say, oh, well, yeah, but she planned it and it was all good, and so, like, it can't be traumatic. Well, that's not true, because whatever it is that people are experiencing is their own trauma. And so no one can say, yes, it is, or no, it isn't. And so that is something that's super, super important. And so with that is, and so as we were actually going through and planning my next offering, that was one of the things that was, like, super important, is that I wanted to be able to have something that allowed me to be able to do those things. And so Mother Soul Medicine sessions are specifically about being able to use that psychotherapy piece, as well as bringing in that holistic approach, and using some of the that spiritual base of being able to help people deal with their past traumas so people have actually gone and had psychotherapy done, or have had spiritual work, and being able to combine the two, I find, is, like, so transformational and so healing, and it just allows us to be able to have those pieces. It doesn't mean that again, those trauma symptoms don't come back up, or those things don't come back into play again, but it allows us to be able to have a different place to be able to go with things. And so again, that is what Mother Soul Medicine offers my clients. And so I am thankful to have been able to launch that this week, actually. So it was on Monday that I was able to do that. And so with this particular program is I use the medicine wheel. And so the medicine wheel is something that allows me to be able to bring into to light with my clients of being able to have all the different aspects. So there's 4 areas in the medicine wheel, and how their particular situation fits within that medicine wheel, and how they're able to try and cope with being able to deal with their situations. And so ironically, one of the things, and I just shared this yesterday because it just happened to come up. So 3 years ago, before I had actually officially started my business, because July 2015 is when I started, but on May 1st, 2015, my profile picture was that of the medicine wheel. And so I've used the medicine wheel in my own personal life, because I find it very effective. And when I did training on the medicine wheel in psychotherapy, I had used it with only one client. And so it was just the way that the circumstances had come up. And so we had done so we used that with the medicine wheel. And so ironically, yesterday, my profile reminder, like when we get those memory things, reminded me that 3 years ago, on May 1st, that I had actually put the medicine wheel up as my profile picture. And so here I am 3 years later, launching a program that I have incorporated the medicine wheel. So, like, super, super excited. So, at that point, this is all that I have. And so I'm just going to go back to read. So Janice's message says, many people don't think about pregnancy loss for whatever reason. And yeah, you're right, Janice, unfortunately, that is something. So people who've had miscarriages are dismissed because the baby wasn't born anyway, or people that have had abortions for different reasons, right? So there's some people that have had them for there are many reasons. There's many reasons to have an abortion, and whether people believe or don't believe that people should have abortions, that's not the point, right? So that's neither here nor there for anybody. It's about people's own personal choices for their particular situations. But you're right, pregnancy loss is huge, and so that's something that's very, very difficult. And so, and especially when we're actually talking about wanting to be a mom, right? So for those of us, for 90% of us, because not everybody wants to be a mom, but 90% of us or more love being a mom. And that is something that is, like, I would die for my children, and they're 21 and 23. So like they are my world, even as adults. And so when they were little, it was like, Mama Bear coming through, like, you're not going to do anything to harm my kids, right? So we always want to be able to protect our kids. And when we're struggling with our own traumas, that makes things like even that much more difficult. So one of the things that I want to leave you with, however, is you are stronger than you think. So no matter what your experiences are, you are stronger than what you think. And the things that you've actually learned to be able to do has made all the difference in the world. And so so just be able to remember that and just kind of keep that in check. And so as I sign off, so unless there's anybody else that has anything else to add, I think I've been on a little bit longer than I think Flora tries to keep us at half an hour, and I'm like 45 minutes, so I'm really, really sorry. I talk a lot, right? So, so talking feather women. And so, which is why I typically don't do an initial session at 60 minutes, because it just never happens, because there's lots to be able to talk a lot and talk about. And so 60 minutes is definitely not enough time for us to be able to kind of get past history. So my initial sessions are always 90 minutes. And so, but I'm going to leave everybody with that. So unless there's something else that somebody wants to share, but if you're on the replay on this, then please make sure that you actually hashtag replay, so that I actually know that, so that I can catch your messages. And in the meantime, I'm going to share Thuja's blog, because I think that it's super, super important. And I'm hoping that Thuja doesn't mind. If she does, then I'll take it off. But I'm going to assume she did post it publicly, so I'm going to share it in here on this post. And yes, talks are definitely healing, and that is something. So I use a lot of journaling, which is my own personal talk, as well as talking through different things, and things come up as I'm going through. And it definitely is healing. And I've seen that healing with talk therapy. I use narrative therapy as the approach that I use with most of my clients. And so it is, and the narrative is your story, because it is your story. It's not my story, right? So, and that is the approach that I typically use with my clients. And so, but on that note, I'm going to leave you. And oh, thanks, Thuja. So Thuja, I hope that you are okay with me being able to share your blog, because I'm going to attach that to here, and because I think that it's super, super important for that message that you've shared with people. So I'm going to attach it to this, and if you don't want it on here, then I will remove it. But otherwise, I'm going to share it here. And so blessings to each and every one of you, and love to all, and talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you very much, Shauna, for being here. Maybe